In this Final Fantasy Draft Guide, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons for each color. I will provide archetype overviews, go through some combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Job Select, Tiered, Saga Creatures, and Through the Ages cards. Job Select is a fairly straightforward mechanic found on equipments, which basically spots you a free equip to a 1/1 creature. So in the case of Dragoon's Lance, it has Job Select, so you spend 1 and a white, you have your equipment enter, and when it enters, you create a 1/1 colorless hero creature token, then attach your Dragoon's Lance to it. Pretty straightforward. Next is the tiered mechanic, which lets you choose one additional cost as you cast the spell, so you have to choose one. You get the option of 3 modes, Fire, Fira, or Firaga in the case of fire magic, and then after you choose which mode you're casting, you just spend the required mana. So you can spend either a single red mana, you can spend 2 in a red if you're casting the Fire mode, or 5 in a red if you're casting the Firaga mode. So you have options with your spells, but it's fairly straightforward. The next mechanic is Saga Creatures, which are sagas, which is a mechanic that has been seen before, but it is attached to a creature. So your saga has combat stats, but it will still sacrifice itself after its final chapter. So keep in mind that the creature is just temporary, unless of course it trades off or does other things that creatures do, like blocking or gets removed by a removal spell or things like that. Now, the final mechanic is found in booster packs. 1/3 of the booster packs are going to have a card that is from these Through the Ages, which is going to have weird art, or not weird, but different art that you might not be used to, but you can take these cards, play these cards, and include them in your decks. They just are going to look a little bit different than the other cards you're including. Now, on to the top commons, kicking things off with white. At number 1 is Weapons Vendor, which is a little bit small for 4 mana, but it does get you a card when it comes into play, and any of your equipments are going to be much easier to put onto your creatures thanks to that second ability. And especially with a lot of Job Select cards that have relatively high equip costs, Weapons Vendor is going to be really nice. At number 2 is White Auracite, so for 4 mana you get a removal spell that also taps to add a mana, which can accelerate you up your curve, give you extra mana to use equip abilities, or really just give you extra mana that you can use for whatever you want attached to a removal spell, which is going to be really nice. It's also an artifact for any synergies that care about those. Then at number 3 is Quarrel, which is 2 mana for a 2/2, so already reasonable stats for an aggressive beatdown creature, but then if you get to the mid or late game and you have some extra mana, you can use it to tap down your opponent's non-enchantment creatures, which is really nice utility to have on a 2-drop creature that's already got some pretty efficient stats. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Dragoon's Wyvern. So for 3 mana, you get a 2-powered flyer and a 1/1 ground creature, so that's really nice. If you can manage to trade off one of those creatures for one of your opponent's threats, then you're going to be up whatever card you have left, which is really nice to have on a 3-drop, and the evasion is nice. It is going to be a nice tool to have at 3 mana. You also gain access to Stuck in Summoner's Sanctum at the number 2 common. You get a removal spell that has flash, can tap enchanted permanents and keep them tapped, and also prevent any activated abilities from being activated. It will still keep passive abilities if it has those, but it's still a nice removal spell at instant speed in blue. And then at number 3 is Ice Magic, another instant speed interaction spell. It has the tiered mechanic, so it can either be a bounce spell or put a creature back into its owner's top or bottom of the library, or even shuffle it into their library if you have an insane amount of mana for the Blizzaga mode. But basically, a bounce spell or card that just puts the card into their deck is going to be really nice utility and flexibility to have at instant speed, and it's a card you'll be happy to have. Next up is black. At number 1 is Vane's Treachery, a really nice efficient removal spell that can kill small creatures, but in the mid to late stages of the game when you want to kill something bigger, if you have something to sacrifice, which you often will, an artifact or a creature, then you can kick it to kill something much bigger with -6/-6. So efficient removal early and still able to kill things late at an efficient rate is going to be a card you're happy to take. At number 2 is Sephiroth's Intervention. So for 4 mana, you destroy a creature, instant speed, and you gain 2 life. So a lot of the time, these more expensive removal spells might not be as good because if you kill a cheaper creature, you feel like you've kind of lost tempo and you're still behind. But because it gains you the life, if you do have to use it on a cheap creature to stop early aggression from your opponent, that 2 life is really going to help you stabilize. So just a really nice removal spell at instant speed in black. Then at number 3 is Hecdize. For 2 mana, you get a 1/1 that makes each opponent discard a card when it comes into play. So it gets you a little bit of value. Leaves behind a body that you can use to sacrifice to things, you can use to potentially trade with things, you can use it to chump block. Lots of uses for that card, and nabbing a card out of your opponent's hand is really nice. Next up is red. At number 1 is Thunder Magic, another tiered spell, a very flexible removal spell. You can either have a 1 mana deal 2 to target creature, a 4 mana deal 4 to target creature, or potentially a 7 mana deal 8 to target creature, though usually you're going to be using the Thunder and Thundara modes, the 2 mana and 4 mana modes, the 2 damage and 4 damage modes, to be able to really take care of either early threats or mid-game threats. And that's a really powerful, flexible option to have on an instant speed removal spell. Next up is Suplex. So for 2 mana, you get to deal 3 damage to target creature at sorcery speed. If it would die, it exiles instead, which is just really nice, a good efficient card. Or you could exile target artifact, which is pretty nice as well, with all of the equipments running around in the format and other artifacts as well. So a really nice removal spell to have at the number 2 slot. Then at number 3 is Sabo Tender, so an aggressive early threat. It's a 2/1 reach for 2, which isn't the greatest rate, but whenever a land you control enters, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if you play this on turn 2 and it doesn't die, just playing lands over the course of the game is going to deal 3 or 4 damage to your opponent naturally, and that's really great upside to have on a 2-drop that can still attack, can still block, can still trade with your opponent. It just does damage passively and will often demand an answer. Next is green. So at number 1 is Chocobo Kick. For 2 mana, you get to have target creature you control deal damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls, which is the best removal green tends to get. And you even have the kicker mode of returning land you control to your hand, and if you do that, then the creature does twice that much damage instead. So your smaller creatures can take down bigger creatures, which is a really nice upside to have on this sort of card, because even if you just have something like a 3/3 in play or a 3-powered creature, you can still take down almost all of the big creatures. And returning a land to your hand can be really great upside with cards like the Chocobo Birds, which a card like Gaisal Greens makes. For 2 mana, you get a 2/2 green bird that says when a land you control enters, the token gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So Chocobo Kick, returning a land to your hand, is nice because then you can re-trigger those birds that you're going to be making. Gaisal Greens is really good because you make a 2-powered creature that can attack for 3 oftentimes in the early turns, which is really a lot of damage for a 2-drop, and it can even flash back later in the game to make another creature that can potentially attack for 3 as long as you have lands to play. And make sure you try to save those lands if you do have a card like Gaisal Greens in your deck. In those later stages of the game, just keep the lands in your hand to potentially enable landfall later. Now, Balam T. Rexor is a really nice card at the number 3 slot in green. It is a really big creature. It gains you some life, so it's great at stabilizing. It has trample, so it's nice at beating down your opponent. And as a buyout clause, it has this forest cycling for 2 mana. So if you really just need to hit your land drops in the early turns of the game, Balam T. Rexor has you covered. You can cycle it to find a forest, which isn't the best use of your early turns, but is still better than not having that option, and is a really good flexible card as a result. Moving on to the color rankings, it's worth, of course, noting that it's better to draft the open colors than a color that is like quote unquote better. But if you do have a close pick, these can be a nice tiebreaker. So just use those as those. But at number 1 is black. Great removal spells, great value spells that I wasn't even able to showcase in the top comments, and just a really nice color with a lot of depth overall. Green also has a lot of depth, really powerful cards on rate and good value as well, and even has some removal that it doesn't always get good removal. Blue, we already showed off some of those good cards. It also has some good card draw options we weren't able to show, and pairs nicely with some blue and black cards, as well as the other colors. The archetype are pretty strong. Red, coming in a little bit lower, just doesn't have the same depth as some of the other colors, which means like once you get past the top 4 or 5 commons, it does get a little bit worse, or the cards are a little bit more niche. And then white coming in last place. By no means is it a bad color. They're all good colors, but white is just a little bit weaker than the other colors. Its top commons just aren't quite as powerful as what some of the other colors are working with, and so it comes in last as a result. Moving on to the archetype overviews, kicking things off with red-white, which is an equipment aggro deck. So you gain access to a card like Giot, King of the Dwarves, so a 2-mana 1/1 double strike, wears equipments really well, and then when a Giot or another dwarf or an equipment enters, you can discard a card to draw a card, which lets you filter through your deck to make sure you're not just getting mana flooded, and helps you find more equipments to be synergistic. Then you also gain access to a card like Samurai's Katana, so it's 2 and a red, it has that job select mechanic, so it will come in basically as a 3/3 trample haste, and then it will be able to equip later on to give other things +2/+2 trample and haste. So if you have ways to equip your creatures, like we already looked at in the white commons, then being able to equip for cheaper does get better with a card like Samurai's Katana, and it's just a really nice 3-mana 3/3 trample haste, great aggressive threat. Then you also gain access to Adalbert Steiner, so a nice 2-mana 2/1 with lifelink, and it gets +1/+1 for each equipment you control. So if you have a bunch of these job select cards in your deck, Adalbert Steiner can be a big threat, and it's really not a lot of investment to just get a pretty sizable creature. Next is blue-black, which is a control deck. You gain access to Ultimacia Time Sorceress as a great top-end threat. So whenever it enters or attacks, you surveil 2, so it filters your draws. And if you can really fill your graveyard to get 8 cards in there, and you get up to 8 mana, you can transform Ultimacia into the Ultimacia Omnipotent, which is going to be a giant menace creature that lets you take an extra turn and really finishes off your opponent in a hurry. You also gain access to the efficient removal spell Sleep Magic, so this is a great tool for helping you get to that late game scenario by just being a 1 mana answer to most creatures, though if they do have a way to like ping their own creature, they can untap it. That's not going to happen all that often, and so Sleep Magic is going to be a great answer. And then Demon Wall is another really good early blocker that once you get to the late game, you can spend 6 mana to put a couple counters on it and turn it into a win con. So early defense plus win con is just what a blue-black control deck is looking for. Next is green-white, which is a go-wide deck. So a card like Renoa Heartilly is really nice as a 5-mana 4/4 that comes with a 1/1, and then when it attacks, you get to give another creature +1/+1 for each creature you control. So it comes in with 2 creatures, so it's going to give something +2/+2. Like, it can't target itself, but you can give for example, Angelo the dog +2/+2, and if you have other creatures in play, it only gets better. You also gain access to Rydia's Return as a 5-mana way to give all your creatures +3/+3 until end of turn, which is a ton of stats. So if you have a few creatures in play, this can easily help you swing in to win the game. And if you don't have a bunch of creatures, you can return 2 permanents from your graveyard to your hand. So get some creatures so that you can then have other cards that potentially care about having creatures in play. Then Crystal's Chosen provides a ton of stats. You get to not only make 4 1/1s, which really is a ton of creatures on the board, you then get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So at the bare minimum, it's making 8 power, 8 toughness, but if you have a couple other creatures in play, this is easily going to be a game-winning spell in this archetype. Next is blue-red, which is a deck that cares about casting big spells, so non-creature spells that cost 4 or more mana. So the Emperor of Palimacia is a perfect card for this deck. It comes in on turn 2 and can ramp you up to turn 4 immediately, to 4 mana spells on the very next turn if you can hit your land drops. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, if at least 4 mana was spent to cast it, you get to put a counter on the Emperor of Palimacia. Then if you can do that to get 3 counters, you can flip it into the Lord Master of Hell, which is a really nice big creature. It's going to have 4 +1/+1 counters on it. It's going to have 3 +1/+1 counters on it at that point by the time it flips. So remember that, and it'll be able to deal a bunch of damage to your opponent when it does attack. Next is Ultros. Then next up is Ultros Obnoxious Octopus. So it's a nice payoff because when you're casting these big spells, if they're not affecting the board state, like their card draw or things like that, Ultros buys you extra time to be deploying those cards by tapping down creatures and putting stun counters on them, so preventing them from attacking you for a turn. And if you're trying to beat down your opponent, it can lock them down for 2 turns of blocks. So that's really nice. One of the benefits of having this sort of card. And if you cast a really big spell, you can put 8 counters onto the Ultros, which is going to turn into a gigantic threat that has to be answered, or probably just wins you the game on the spot. Then there is Shantoto, Tactician Magician. So for 3 mana, you get a 0/4, which is a little bit small, but when you cast non-creature spells that are big, then you get to draw a card, and when you cast any non-creature spell, you give it +S+O, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast it. So Shantoto fits perfectly into this archetype. Next is green-black, which is a deck that cares about the graveyard. So Cloud of Darkness is a great 5-mana play. If you fill your graveyard a little bit, you're going to be able to kill creatures based on the number of permanent cards in your graveyard, so fill your graveyard with permanents. The Final Days is another great card in this deck. On its front side, you get to just make two creatures that come into play tapped. But if it goes into your graveyard after via casting it or via milling it over or something like that, you can flash it back for 6 mana to make X of those tokens, where X is the number of creatures in your graveyard. So if you can really fill your graveyard, you can make an army with just 1 card. And then Diamond Weapon also cares about the number of permanents in your graveyard. You can get a massive threat that is immune to combat damage. So that's really, really strong. And it even has reach. So another really good payoff for filling your graveyard. Next is blue-white, which is a deck that cares about artifacts. So Sid, Timeless Artificer, is really nice in this deck because it's going to buff your artifact creatures and heroes. And so remember, the job select cards create heroes. So if you have any of those, they count as artifacts for the artifact synergy, and those heroes will get buffed by Sid, which is really nice to have. And then Sid, even if he dies, if you have multiple copies of it, it gets even better in multiples because you can cycle one, play the other one. They work for artifacts based on the artificers you control and in your graveyard. So pretty cool card to have access to in your blue-white artifacts deck. Ash, Princess of Dalmasca, is really nice as well as a 3/2. For 3, you can attack, look at the top 5, find an artifact from among those, and put it into your hand. So that's going to be a good card advantage engine, especially if you can get multiple attacks in with it. And then Valkyrie Aerial Unit is a nice card as well, with affinity for artifacts, going to come in for cheaper and be a nice flyer that surveils you too to find more of your artifacts. Next is red-green, which is a landfall aggro deck. Gladiolus Amicitia is a really great top-end card in this deck because it comes into play on turn 6, gets to search for a land card, so you immediately get to trigger its landfall ability, the landfall ability of any of your other cards, and when a land you control enters, another target creature gets +2/+2 and trample until end of turn, which is really a lot of stats and even can buff up your big creatures, which is great. Sandworm is another great card in this deck. 5 mana, 5/4 haste, so it hits like a truck and really quickly when it does come into play. And when it enters, you can destroy a land, so you're often going to destroy your own land to have be able to search for another basic land card, put it into play, tap, and shuffle. So you can basically double trigger your landfall cards that particular turn, because you play a land, play Sandworm, kill a land, get another land into play. So that can double trigger your landfall cards, which is great. And then Saz's Chocobo is a really great card to have on turn 1 in these decks. You play it, and then anytime you have a land enter, you get a counter onto the Chocobo, which can just take over the game in a hurry and just grow into a giant threat that only cost you 1 mana up front. Next is white-black, which is a sacrifice deck, so you really want to have cards that generate expendable bodies or get you a little bit of value when they come into play, so you don't mind sacrificing them, then cards that sacrifice, and then cards like Judge Magister Gabaranth, which grows whenever another creature or artifact you control dies into a big threat that has menace. Grahatia is an amazing card in this deck because it's a 5-drop that whenever one or more creatures or artifacts you control die, you draw a card. So you can do this by just sacrificing an artifact on your turn. If you sacrifice an artifact on your opponent's turn, it'll also trigger. So if you have multiple ways to sacrifice, you can sacrifice on your turn, draw a card, sacrifice on your opponent's turn, draw a card, and it even has reach. So it's a great card that's going to grind out your opponent. And then Albed Salvagers is a great 3-drop, pretty reasonable stats, 3 mana, 2/3, and then it drains your opponent for a lot of damage as creatures and artifacts you control die. Next is blue-green, which is a ramp deck that has a little bit of caring about the towns, which are non-basic lands that enter the battlefield tapped for multiple colors. They are the common land fixing in this set. We will cover them in the mana fixing section of this video, but there is a little bit of a town theme with this ramp deck. So Ignis Scientia is really nice as a 3-mana 2/2, comes into play. You can look at the top 6 of your cards of your library for a land, and so it doesn't have to be a basic land. So if you do have a town in your top 6, you can find it with your Ignis Scientia, and then it also has the activated ability to mess with graveyards. If you're exiling creatures from graveyards, you're creating food to help you stabilize. So a really great card for this deck. And it's important to note you can exile cards from any graveyard, so you can exile cards from your opponents, maybe mess up their synergies. Next is Reach the Horizon, which is a really good 4-drop for this deck because you get to go straight from 4 mana all the way up to 6 mana. You go ramp. You can also search up town cards, so you can get non-basic lands into play for any cards that care about that, and that's effective as well. And then Travel the Overworld is a really good town payoff in this deck. If you have a few towns in play, you can cast this for cheaper, and it's a really good way to refuel your hand once you've invested some mana and cards into ramping up and getting to the late game. Being able to refill your hand so you can draw your powerful payoffs is really, really nice, and Travel the Overworld helps you do that. Next is Black-Red, which is a deck that cares about casting non-creature spells to ping your opponent with these little black wizard creature tokens, which are pretty cool. So Garland, Knight of Cornelia is a really good 2-drop in this deck because whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to Surveil 1, which can help you find your synergy pieces. And then if Garland dies, you can pay 3 black, red to return it from the graveyard to the battlefield transformed to have it come into play as Chaos the Endless. So it can come into play as a 5/5 that's going to eventually be sent to the bottom of your library. So a really nice card to have access to. There's also Black Waltz number 3. So 4 mana for a 2/2 flyer Death Touch. So it attacks pretty well. It can also just trade off with anything because of Death Touch. And when you cast a non-creature spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So really does pay you off for casting those non-creatures. And then Queen Brawn, 3 mana for a 2/1 prowess. So cares about non-creatures. And whenever it attacks, you create a 0/1 black wizard creature token with whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this token deals 1 damage to each opponent. So you can start building up an army of these 0/1s that pay you off for casting your non-creature spells, and that's really going to be effective, especially if you can enable some attacks for your Queen Brawn. Moving on to some combat tricks to be aware of. These are the common combat tricks that you should make sure you play around. There's You're Not Alone in white to give creature +2/+2, or if they control 3 or more creatures, it gets +4/+4. So keep that one in mind for sure. There's also Haste Magic, which not only can buff stats with +3/+1, but also gives haste. So keep that in mind if you are at a low life total, trying to swing the game in your favor. Maybe you think you've stabilized. Keep in mind the fact that your opponent could make a creature have haste out of nowhere potentially. So it also exiles the top card of the library, so it can get a little bit of value. There's Blitzball Shot to give +3/+3 and trample in green. In blue, there's Magic Damper to give a creature hexproof, +1/+1, and untap it. So keep that in mind. It can make a creature ambush you potentially. There's Vincent's Limit Break. So it's a tiered spell, but at its base level, it's going to have the creature die and then return to the battlefield with the base stats 3/2, which is worth noting that it will trigger any death effects, any enters the battlefield effects again, which is an effective, potentially combat trick, depending on what you are using it on. And then there's Q-Trube Forayer, which isn't technically an instant speed combat trick, but it does destroy target creature that was dealt damage this turn. So I wanted to mention it here because if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, like attacking a 1/1 into your 6/6, and you're like, oh, there's none of these combat tricks that are going to get me here, they might be using their Q-Trube Forayer, which basically gives retroactive death touch to a creature, which is why I wanted to include it here. So keep that card in mind. Next are some trap cards to avoid. First is Stolen Uniform. So it's basically a way to cheat equipments onto a creature. So if you have a creature with an expensive equipment with an expensive equip cost, you can spend use Stolen Uniform, choose a creature, choose and an equipment, which is either yours or an opponent's. You take the equipment, put it onto the creature. But the fact is that in limited, there's not going to be equipments that you really need to do this with. You'd much be better have other cards in your deck that are more versatile, that can be used in many more scenarios. And oftentimes, by the time you can set this card up, you'll just have the mana to equip your expensive equipment anyway. And your opponent, relying on your opponent to play an equipment to steal, is not going to be worth it. So just avoid this card and you'll be happy you did. Next is Phantom Train, which is another card that looks like it has potential, but the fact that you don't have any buyout crewing on this card, you have to sacrifice something if you want to crew it, makes it a really tough card to use, because if you don't have any other creatures or artifacts in play, this card just does nothing. And there's a lot of scenarios where you just need to have any creature. You just need to have anything that can attack your opponent. You're just both in top deck mode. You play this thing, it just basically does nothing if you both have an empty board state, or you're just trying to stabilize and you need a blocker really desperately. Just like any 4-drop that can block will help you deal with your opponent's aggression. Phantom Train doesn't really help you do that unless you have other creatures and artifacts, which is just not always going to be a guarantee. Not a card you should generally be trying to include. And then Random Encounter is another card that's just too unreliable, too finicky. You spend 6 mana and you don't even know what you're going to get. And that's just, you can get way better things for 6 mana. And so just avoid this card. Next are some combos that you can assemble in this set with just commons and uncommons. The first one is Fang, Fearless Lassie, and Vanille, Cheerful Lassie. So when you have these two cards in play, both of which are great individually in this black-green deck, you can have a nice little combo where you meld them at the beginning of your first main phase for 5 mana to get Ragnarok, Divine Deliverance, which is going to be a giant card with Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Haste, and when it dies, you destroy a permanent, return non-legendary permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. So a really nice effect to have on Ragnarok, Divine Deliverance. Next up is the combo between Evil Reawakened and a card like Marlborough. So Evil Reawakened lets you return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield with a couple of counters on it, but you might not have a big creature you want to reanimate by turn 5. And a card like Marlborough, which has Swamp Cycling, so you can discard it to search for a swamp card, let's put itself into the graveyard so that when you do have your Evil Reawakened, you can cast it on turn 5 knowing you'll have that Marlborough in your graveyard, or whichever other land cycler you want to get, or something like that. So it's really nice to have a way to fill your graveyard with a card that would be nice to bring back with your Evil Reawakened. Next is the combo between Quina, Q Gourmet, and the Gold Saucer. So Quina says, if one or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a 1/1 green frog creature token are created instead. And the Gold Saucer lets you spend 2 mana, tap it, and flip a coin, and if you win the flip, you get to create a treasure token. So over the course of a long extended game, if you're in a board stall and you have your Quina and the Gold Saucer, you can just be activating that ability, and then every time you win the flip, you get not only a treasure, but you also get a frog token. And so that's going to be a nice little upside to have in your Quina decks. Then there is the combo, the classic Steal and Sack. So Unexpected Request, 2 in a red, you gain control of target creature until end of turn, and untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn, and then you can attach an equipment to it. So basically you can take your opponent's creature with Unexpected Request, hit them with it, and then at the end of the step, you would give the creature back because you only gain control of it until end of turn. But if you have a card like Ahriman to sacrifice it, you can spend 3 mana to sacrifice another creature or artifact you control to draw a card. You can take your opponent's creature with Unexpected Request, then hit them with it, and then sacrifice it to something like Ahriman, which is a really good way to turn your Unexpected Request into a great removal spell. Next is the mana fixing available in the set. I said I would mention the towns. These are the 10 towns. In 55% of booster packs, you will see a town in the basic land slot. So these cards are going to be seen quite frequently. They're going to help you fix your mana, and they are great ways to make your mana base a little bit better without having to invest spell slots from your deck. If you do have to take some spells, though, these are the common mana fixing cards. There's Crossroads Village, which enters tapped, and you can choose a color as it enters to have it tap for that color. So that's a nice way to fix your mana. There's World Map, which comes into play. Then you can spend for 1 mana. Then you can spend another 1 mana, sack it to search for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand. So that's a way to fix your mana as well. Or you can spend 3, tap it, sacrifice it to get any land card and put it into your hand. So if you have a town you really want to get, for example. There's Blitzball at colorless. It's a little bit weaker. It taps for mana of any color. And then if you hit your opponent with a legendary creature, you can sack it to draw 2 cards. But if you don't have a legendary creature, it's a little bit weaker. So make sure you have some legendaries if you are going to include Blitzball, because you really like having that ability to turn your mana ramp into cards later in the game as an option at the very least. And then Precious Wanderings is another way to get ramp and fixing in green. So Precious Wanderings, search for a basic land card or town card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. And this is also a way to trigger your landfall card. So if you go turn 2, make one of the Chocobo birds with the common we looked at earlier. Turn 3, Precious Wanderings, you can put a counter on that, trigger landfall twice. It's definitely a way to trigger your landfall cards in additional time, so keep that in mind. Moving on, this is a bit of a summary sheet. There will be a place where you can download this linked in the description down below, but it has all of the archetypes. They aren't ranked because it's better to draft the open archetype, as I said, than it is to try and force an archetype. So these archetypes are not ranked, but this is just their general strategy. So you can just have that available and know where a card might try to fit in. And then the top commons that we discussed and the color rankings that were discussed. So this is going to be a nice little resource you can use to maybe just summarize a lot of this information in one place. Anyway, though, that is going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag #FantasyDrafter in the comment section down below. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you battling in Final Fantasy, and I will talk to you next time.